Hey everyone, today I want to talk about how we can set up different objects in our scene to make animation a little bit easier. The first trick that we want to learn is parenting. We've talked about this a little bit before. What we want to do is start off with at least two objects. So we're going to kind of pretend that the sphere is kind of the head of a character and the cube is the body. Now to create a parent-child hierarchy here, all we have to do is grab whatever's going to be the child and drag it into the parent, and you'll see it creates this hierarchy in our scene list here. And if I was to grab the parent object and move, scale, or rotate it, you'll see the child kind of moves with it. This also works for animation, so if we were to just say, let's have this object move from here to here, we can go to the beginning of our scene, move this into place, key our move values, so X, Y, and Z position, and then go further in time, move this over, and because MODO by default has auto keying on, as soon as I move this, you'll see that the Z value got keyed at frame 120. Now if we wanted this to kind of jump in the middle here, we can just drag that up. And you'll notice that when I drag that up, it keys Y, but at frame 120, Y isn't keyed, so the object is going to just go up and kind of stay up as it goes across. So at frame 120, I'm just going to make sure my Y value is keyed by typing in 0 and hitting enter. And you'll see that turns red, telling me that it has a keyframe there. And you can see this is now going up and down. Now, if I wanted to, let's say at frame 60, have this sphere kind of move up off the body a little, just to kind of exaggerate it, I could do that by keying its position at, let's say, frame 40. So we're going to go to key our position here. And then at frame 60, I'm going to move this up a little. And at frame 80, I'm going to move this back down. And you'll notice that it's not 0, of course, but it is relative to my entire scene and not to the object below it, or like the parent object. So keep that in mind. The values here don't change to reflect the offset from the parent object. But yeah, now you can see, like, I can animate that child independently of the parent. So I can even do something like, let's say we key our scale value at frame 50 and frame 70, and then at frame 60 we're just going to scale this up a bit. So the child can be animated independently, and there's no move keyframes except for between frames 40 and 60. So there's nothing telling this sphere, hey, move from here all the way here. It's just following along with the parent. Okay. Now the next thing that we want to look at is our object centers. So let's actually do this in a new scene. So here we have a new object, and if we were to scale or rotate this, it's going to scale or rotate from the middle. That's because the center of our object is located by default in the middle of our geometry. We talked about how we can accidentally change the center of our object. Let's say if we were to move the polygons in the object instead of moving the object as a whole, for example. Now the center of my object, if I go back into item mode, is down here, and I'd be scaling from there or rotating from there instead of rotating from the middle of my object. We also mentioned that we can fix that by going to Edit, Center to Bounding Box, Center, and that repositions the center of your object in this kind of invisible imaginary bounding box, which would be essentially a box made from the furthest points of the object. So we can also go into that menu to change our kind of center position to different parts of our object. So if we wanted this center to be kind of at the left of the object, now if I go to my move tool, well, I don't think, yeah, move tool, I was just turned around a little bit, but yeah, now my center is at the left side of this object, and you can see I rotate and scale from there. But if we want to have finer control over where the center is, we can do that by using the center selection here. And that's going to bring up this kind of display for the center that looks like a transform manipulator, but it's just the point that the center is at. And we want to also just keep in mind that when we're done playing around with the center, we want to turn that off, because otherwise we'll still be manipulating the center. But we can turn this on. I believe that's connected to the 6 key. Space, select the object, 7, select the center, and we can move that into place. So we can say, hey, we want to put this in the corner here. We can also, of course, turn on snapping. So snapping, alt click to make sure I'm on vertex snapping, then drag this over to that point right there, like that. And now if I exit this mode, I'm just going to hit 5 to go back to item mode. My center is going to be permanently located there until I like move my components or modify the object more. But this way I can animate this kind of flipping around from that corner if I needed to. So if I wanted to go to frame 0, we'll key our rotation, and then at frame 120, let's say this rotates, we'll put in some values here. So let's do 360. So it comes all the way around. Now it's rotating from that point. And we'll also rotate on my z-axis here. So we'll do 360 there as well. And you can see this kind of more intense animation, as if it's almost like at a point here it looks like it's just hanging from that point. So you can really kind of modify your centers ahead of time, and then not have to like try to just keep playing around with your keyframes to get an animation like this, right? To animate this using the center of my object, I would first need to animate it moving around, and then we would have to animate it rotating as well independently, right? So this makes my life a lot easier and just lets me kind of finally control where the centers of these objects are. So while that lets us change the position of our center, sometimes we want to change the orientation of our center. I'm going to create an example of this in this scene. So what I'm going to do here is just take this top polygon and scale it down, and let's actually scale the entire object down a little bit. Oops. Okay. Also going to copy this polygon into a new mesh, so Control C, N, Control V, and we're going to actually just rename this to body, and we'll call this one an arm. And what I'm going to do on the arm here, at least, is first I'm going to go into item mode, or sorry, polygon mode, select that polygon. I'm going to go to my scale tool, and I'm going to go to a local axis so that I can kind of scale this flat, but keep it kind of on that surface, right? And I'm going to move this over to this section here, so it's like the arm of the body, and I'm going to do a simple extrusion. So polygons, extrude, click, pull that out. Let's do that again. Whoops, I did it with both selected, so just select that one. I'm going to bevel this time, and bevel this guy out. Okay, very simple shape. We're going to leave it unsmooth and just work with it as this, right? So this new mesh item has its center over here, which is problematic because it's going to rotate, first of all, if I was rotating this arm kind of upwards, I wouldn't want it to rotate like that. So I would want to change my center, right? First thing I'm going to do is get out of this view and look at my front view here. And we're going to go to the center for this object. Now remember, the workflow is turn on center, select it by clicking on it, then move it into place. So let's say it's around here. One of the things we can do is, if we wanted to use snapping to be a little bit more precise, we can turn snapping on. In the options here, we can go to polygon center, turn off vertex, and then grab this from the middle, and you see as I get near that polygon center, it's going to snap. So that's very convenient. I'm going to turn snapping off, and I'm going to get out of my object mode by just clicking on that button. And now you'll see that if this arm was to rotate, you can at least have it rotating from here, right? However, there's another issue, which is that when this is rotating, you'll see it's kind of digging into the body there, right? You can see it right there. This line is the body, that line is the geometry for the arm. So what we can do here is, just like we changed the center of our object, we can change the orientation of that same point. And to do this, we're going to go into this menu again, but we're going to click and hold and select pivot. Now, pivot is actually attached to the 6 key, right? And center's attached to the 7 key. So it might look like you have the center selected when you have the pivot selected. The only difference is there's a little kind of checkerboard pattern over the pivot. But yeah, so we're going to select this object, select its pivot, and you're going to see that the pivot is wherever you put the center. But we can select that, and then we can rotate it. And we typically want the y-axis to kind of be aligned with one of the surfaces that you want to rotate it against. You could really do it on any axis. It's going to affect which axis you animate on. But I'm used to sticking with Y just as my up, so I'm going to leave it like that. And again, you want to make sure you get out of this mode, so I'm just going to click that to return into item mode. Now if I was to rotate this object, you'll see that my rotation tool is already a little bit tilted, so I can actually rotate on my x-axis here, and that will rotate more meaningfully. Like it will make sense. It won't dig into the body, and that's really helpful in the end. So let's actually just add some geometry here. I'm going to do a actually, let me undo that rotation there. There we go. I'm going to add an edge loop down the middle here. Oh, that was not what I was expecting. So let's go into item mode, and let's try that one more time. Yep, that's very odd. So I'm going to just go into my add loop tool and add a loop right in the middle there, like that. Gonna bevel that out into 2, and then just use these guys here to kind of bevel out some legs. Alright, so before you actually start animating this, you want to just be sure that you have a kind of a clear plan of what you're going to be doing. So I'm going to be moving this guy across the screen, and I'm just going to animate this hand kind of rotating as he walks. You want to always kind of, before you actually start, make sure that all the things that you're going to animate are working. So like this movement is working fine, the child is moving with it. This rotation is actually giving me some weird issues, right? Like the object seems to be scaling when I am rotating this. So one of the things that I found usually works for that is to just select the parent object here, and we can go down to its mesh properties and we're gonna freeze it. That kind of just resets some of the properties on the object, and I found that typically works. So now I'm going to try that again, and you see that is now rotating without any issues. Okay. Um, just so you guys know it, the reset here. So let's select this object. Reset would basically change all these values to 0. They're already 0, but if I was to move this over, let's say there, reset, my position would change it back if this was rotated and scaled, and moved. Let's just do all of them. Reset all will change me back to 0, 0, 0 for my position and rotation, and 100% for my scale. Um, if we want to establish a new position for this, let's say like, okay, this is going to be the position that it's at permanently, then what we can do is we can change this to be the 0 value for our position. And we could do that by going to 0, position, oops, sorry, 0, position, and that is now my 0 point. So if I make any changes and I want to go back to it, I can. If I knew that this object wants to be 0 at this rotation, negative 90, then I could type that in and just say 0, rotation, and now that is my 0 value. So those buttons are there to kind of just set your kind of center or 0 point for those values, or 100% point for the scale. Anyway, once I went to the parent object and froze it, the rotations on this seem okay. I do notice that that means that my orientation on this has been changed, so let's try fixing that. We'll go to our axis there. Let's just go to a front view and rotate that in, that. Go back to item mode with the 5 key, and yep, that still works. So, you know, just, you'll always want to just do one final like check over everything. Like after I froze, I should have gone through and checked that everything still works fine. So that's good, and that's good. Okay, so let's actually just animate this really quickly. We're going to move him up to here, back to here, key its position, go forwards in time, and key this position with the auto key by just moving it. And then we can say around frame 20, this hand is rotated maybe like that, 49%. That's going to stay there because I didn't set a keyframe of 0 here. So go here, hit 0. So 20. Oops. Let's try that again. I did not actually set it. So I'm going to key the rotation at 0. Let's say we'll actually just key it here as well, and at frame 60 as well. And then in the middle here, actually, let's go to 10. We'll go forwards, and 20, 30. We'll go backwards, and then we'll do 45. Not consistent, that's okay. We can always adjust that. And you can see that now that's rotating while the character is moving. We should also be able to kind of rotate him, so maybe he's doing a spin as he's moving across, right? So we can key his rotation here and key his rotation at 360 here. So rotation on my y-axis. And so now that hand's moving as he's spinning. Okay, so just to get the idea of this parent and child relationship and setting up your centers before you establish that relationship will kind of get you pretty far and make animating a lot easier. Next, what we're going to look at is a couple of other relationships that we can build between objects in our scene. Okay, so I'm going to be working with the setup toolbar, which you can access in the MODO layout by clicking on this button here, setup. We're normally in this modeling toolbar. So I'm going to go over to the setup toolbar. One thing to note, if you want to work in a layout that just has that, you can go to the setup layout, but it's not in the favorited list here. So turn off this little star only button, and then click on setup, and you would see that same toolbar here. Remember, if you want to have this show up in the compress menu, you can just star it and then click this again. It will stay up, right? But anyway, coming back to our MODO layout with the setup toolbar, what you might notice is that there's an option to parent here and unparent, and it's kind of the same situation as what we did here. However, there's this compensation button that I want to kind of show you about, show you how it works. So let's just put in a new scene. I'm going to pull up my model toolbar with F2 so I don't have to keep switching back and forth. I'm going to hit a shift and click on this cube, and then we're going to just add another object here, and I'm going to move the cube back. Okay, so let's actually also rotate this and scale it. All right, now let's say I want this cube to follow the sphere. What I would normally do is just grab the cube here, drag that into the sphere, and now whatever the sphere does, the cube will do as well, right? The other way I can do that using this toolbar is always select the child first and then the parent, and then click on parent, and that will make the same relationship, you see. But sometimes you can run into issues, for example, if both of these objects are kind of over to the side, maybe over this way, and I try to parent this, you'll see that that kind of changes its position. And essentially what's happening here, let's look at this in a different starting point. So I'm going to move both of them back to 0 as far as position goes. I'm going to move this sphere over here, and then I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to select the cube first, control click the sphere, and then parent, and you'll see that the cube essentially moved to have the same transform position as the sphere did, right? And that's because it's just going to try to match it out of the box. So what you would want to do in that case is actually select the cube and select the sphere, turn on this compensation button, and then hit parent in place. So if you drag this toolbar out a little bit, you'll see that says parent in place. And if I do that, it will stay there. It will stay where it was, and now kind of follow along. So just, you know, you should know that if you're using this button, you might need to turn on the compensation so that you don't get a kind of offset from your original starting location. All right. So next thing we want to look at is constraints. I'm going to actually just start a new scene. I'm going to close this one as well. I'm going to throw in a cube and a cone, and I'm going to just move this cube over. All right. So normally, if we wanted these two to kind of rotate together, what we would do is essentially parent them, right? So like put the, oops, let's do that the other way around. We'll put the cone in the cube, and rotating this cube will rotate that and have that kind of offset. But what we can also do is say that when I want to rotate this cube, or when I do rotate this cube, I want this cone to rotate the same way. So to do something like that, what we can do is select the cone first, always select the child first, then control click the parent to select that. And then in this constraints section, this constraints tab, we have this option for constraining the rotation. So if I click that, it's going to look like it does nothing except add this slightly lighter line between the two objects. And if you look closely to your item list, you'll see there's a plus sign next to the cone. And if we open that up, we'll see what's created there is a rotation constraint to the cube object, right? Now, if I was to rotate this cube, you'll see the cone is going to match that, right? One thing to note here, if we want to get rid of that, we can just delete it there. If we wanted to kind of have this starting, let's say like that, 90 degrees, and we were to try to make that same rotation constraint, click that, it's going to go back to its regular state of rotation being 0. So what you want to do is, again, turn on compensation and then click that. Now that's going to start off with a 90-degree turn, and it will match this however you rotate, right? You'll also notice that if we select the constraint itself, you have that offset right there. So it takes that original starting value and puts it in. If I was to set this to 0, then we're back to where we were without compensation, essentially. Okay. So right now this cube can move wherever it wants, but as soon as it rotates, both of them are gonna rotate. We can also have multiple constraints, so we can say, oh, we want rotation and scale, but we don't want position, right? So I can even do it the other way around. I can say this one's controlling the scale. So select the cube, control click the parent, right? The thing you're constraining to, and let's put in a scale constraint, and that's going to be under the cube, and it's saying scale constraint to the cone. And so now if I scale this guy, they both scale. If I rotate this guy, it won't let me do anything because the rotation is controlled by this constraint. If I scale this one, it won't let me do anything because that scale is controlled by the constraint as well. But if I was to rotate this, both will rotate. Okay. Another really cool constraint that we have here, I think you could do position the same way we've been doing. But another cool constraint that we have here is the direction constraint. So let's take a look at that. Going to, actually, let's just new scene it. I'm going to throw in a cone, and I'm going to throw in a sphere, and I'm going to animate this sphere. Let's set up the constraint first. So I'm going to select this and select that, and I'm going to make a direction constraint by clicking on this, and you'll see right away it rotated over to the side. So let's take a look at what the properties are on the constraint that was made. So let me open that up. You wouldn't think you would need compensation on because you didn't actually rotate that cone at all. But if we look at the direction constraints here, instead of just an offset or anything, we have an axis, the axis that's going to look at the object, right? In this case, it went to the z-axis. What we would probably want here is the y-axis. And now if I was to move this cone around, that's going to always point at that sphere, right? So what I can do is like animate just the sphere. Let's say I key its position right there. Maybe here it is there, here, move it up here, 62, move it down here, 82, move it over there. Now, you can imagine how long it would take to kind of animate that cone following along with that sphere, right? This will just kind of give you a quick setup to follow one with the other and let you kind of have this basically has no keyframes on it. It's just following along, and there's just less animation you have to do manually. All right. I'm going to show you one more constraint here, and then we're going to kind of combine some of these into a scene. So let's new scene one more time. We're going to, first in our empty mesh, we're going to draw in a curve. So I'm going to go to actually my top view, and I'm going to go to my model panel, create. I'm just going to use one of our curve tools to kind of draw a line here. Okay. I should not have drawn that in the front view, but that's fine. I meant to draw that in the top view. But we're gonna just let's just rotate the whole thing to be kind of flat, 90 degrees, and then we're going to just zero that out. All right. So next thing we're going to do is go back to setup, and we're going to put in a sphere, and we're going to create a path constraint between the sphere and this curve that we've made by clicking on curve path, and that's going to attach that sphere to the beginning of my curve, right, whichever point I drew first, and it's going to give me a property underneath the sphere that's going to essentially be the constraint, and I can actually animate this path percentage value to say where on the curve this sphere is. So I can go to frame 0, key this at 0, and then go to frame 60 and key this at 100%, and then go to frame 120, key this at 0 again. Now if I hit play, you're going to see it goes down that curve and then back, right? So that's kind of cool. You can take this a step further by, let's actually modify this sphere a little bit. So I'm going to select this top point like that, and then with my fall off on soft selection, I'm just going to kind of scale this in. Maybe like that, just so that it's got a kind of direction. Now, on the constraint itself, we have this option for what axis we're using. So instead of using the z-axis, I'm going to use the y-axis. So that point is kind of following the curve, right? In addition to that, let me add some kind of extrudes along the sides of these. So let's grab these polygons and these polygons, bevel those out. Why is that not working? Let me try that again. B. Oh, because I still have soft selection turned on, so let me turn that off. B. There we go. Okay. So let's kind of pretend those are some wings, right? While I'm animating this, at a point like this, you know, a plane would tilt to one side or the other, and you can actually animate that as well by controlling this roll value. So if I'm at frame 0, key my roll value, maybe around here, I want this to rotate, I guess, that way. And then around here, it would probably be more that way. And then here, I guess I would be back in my positive roll. So if I was to hit play now, so, right, it's going across, and then at this point, it kind of needs to turn around. So what we can do is go back to our constraint. We can say at frame 60, where we're turning around, we're going to actually negate this axis so it turns around. It's going to pop, definitely. It won't be like a smooth pop or a smooth change. But what we're going to do is at frame 59, we'll key this as off, and then frame 60, we'll key it as on. So that's going to be an on-off animation for that value. And so that's going to go that way and then pop back. Now on the way back, we probably want to set some more roll animations. So let's say around here, we're going to change this roll to be too far. kind of like that. And then here, by this point, we would probably want to go back around there. And then here, we'd be back at a negative value. That. And so if we were to scrub through this, we see it kind of rotating that way. Between here and here, it's not rotating. So let's take a look at our values. So we have negative 57, and then at this point we don't have a keyframe, so let's go to like 80. So it's going to make a kind of a sudden turn there, and then it turns around and works its way back, right? So the path constraint is just, it's very useful for like, instead of keying a thing moving through, especially through like a flat path, you just make that constraint and then you animate the percentage. Should get you pretty far if you want to do something like, an example that I've seen a student do is Pac-Man going through a level. You know, you just have to draw out the path that it's going to be moving on instead of animating him going from one point to the next and keying at all those points. Now let's take a look at how we can combine some of these to make a kind of more interesting scene. I'm going to start a new scene here. Let's go back to our quad view with the 0 key on the numpad and throw in another curve. Actually, instead of throwing in another curve, what I'm going to do is select a shape here. Let's say sphere. And I'm going to just generate a curve from this. So I'm going to select that entire ring and go to my modeling panel, curve, edges to curves here. And it lets you pick the type. I'm fine with any of them. Hit OK. Now that curve is actually going to live in this sphere mesh. So I'm just going to delete the polygons there and then rename that to curve. And even though it is a circle, there will be a starting and end point. So when we look at our constraints, just keep that in mind. Remember that when we're working with the constraints, you know, like we can still go past the 0 point. So we'll take a look at that too. Let's go back to our setup panel. We're gonna throw in a sphere. We're gonna make this one quite small. And we're going to attach that to the curve. So I'm going to select my sphere, control click on my curve, and then go to my constraints. And we're going to do a path constraint. So you can see that that's now my 0 point. It's not necessarily starting or ending on an axis. If I open this up, my path percentage is 0 there. So you might notice like I can't actually drag this to a negative value. So what I might want to do is just rotate that curve object. Okay, so just select this guy and rotate him so that it's starting and ending where you want it to start and end. Say right there. We might need to fine tune over here. Okay. So yeah, 30 degrees did the trick for me. Now I'm going to animate this going around. So I'm going to say at frame 0 on the constraint, key the path percentage is 0. At frame 120, key it at 100%. Right. You'll notice if I go past 100%, that's not going to do anything. So that's going to go around like that. And we're going to, let's throw in some more geometry. So let's first throw in a floor. We'll make this bigger and we'll move this down so that the sphere isn't intersecting with it. And then we're going to add in a light. So let's add an item. We'll add a spotlight. We're going to move this light up. Now you might not see it here, so what I'm going to do, whoops, not the P key, O key, turn on show lights. We're going to actually scale this guy down so he's smaller, kind of matches our scene better. And between the light and this sphere, I'm going to try to create a direction constraint. So I'm just going to select that. And now you see that light is going to focus in on that. I'm also going to go and change some of the properties of this light. Let's make the scale a bit smaller, and we'll make the soft edge 0 so that we have a hard edge. Gonna actually just hit the F8 key to preview how that looks, and let's turn off some of the other stuff in our scene. So shading, environment. I'm gonna drop the intensity of this background quite a bit, something like that. And actually we should see, because of that constraint, that light is going to follow that sphere all the way around, right? Now here's an interesting thing about this. If we take the curve mesh here, we can move this and that sphere will move with it. And if we were to move this past the light will follow it up, right? So if we actually animate the position of this, let's key its position here. At frame 60, we'll have it, we'll actually only go that far up, and then at frame 120, we'll set that Y value back to 0. Now that light should kind of follow it up, but once it's up here, if we look at our preview render again, it's going to be illuminated from the side, but there's nothing kind of behind it to show that the light is following it. One thing I want to do here is move this light down a little so that it looks up at it instead. And I also want to change this into a volumetric light. So let me pull that back up, hit play, select my spotlight and its properties. I'm just going to turn volumetrics on. That's going to create that nice little shape there. I can also reduce the height of my volumetrics to kind of, actually I do like that shadow, so I'm going to leave it kind of high. If we go back to an earlier frame, we have it kind of focusing on it there. And another cool thing we can do is, like, just how we have the relationship between the light and this point here, we can do a similar relationship between the camera and that point there. So let's turn on the visibility for our camera. And you can see it's kind of massive here, so we can scale it down if only to see like the icon a little bit better. We can select the camera and select that sphere, and then we can do another direction constraint, and you can see that tilted over. Now if we go to our preview window, that camera is looking down at it, it's kind of following it along, and then we can just kind of play with the position of the camera. We can of course animate the camera, right? We can animate in two ways. The first might be to just animate its position. So let's, we don't want to touch the rotation when there's that constraint. So let's go to frame 0 and we'll key its position like that. And instead of, going around and moving the camera, what I can do here is go to my camera view and then kind of at different frames position my camera how I would think that I want it. So let's say at frame 60 here, I kind of want to see this from the bottom. So it's going to be a little bit odd here because as I move around, it's not going to compensate for that constraint until I stop moving. So let's say I want to like look like from behind the light or just slightly above it. Now my camera is going to be kind of moving down in my scene. And this can be especially disorienting when you kind of don't have a background. So keep that in mind. At frame 180, I kind of want the camera to be in the same position here. And then at frame 120, I want to bring the camera up a little. So like, say, there. Alright, and you'll notice as soon as I move the camera using the Alt key here, it's going to key it because I did change the location of that. So let's say I have this animation kind of going like that, you know. Another thing we could try is just see what this looks like from the center of my scene. So if I just, if I was to right click this, I can say remove all, and it will remove the entire animation for that position, right? So right now my camera is not moving at all. It's just rotating to match everything, and we can see that in the perspective view, right? Where it's following that along. And I kind of think that's interesting. I might want to go to frame 0 and then key the height of this to match the curve here. So I'm going to select my camera and I'm going to select, actually I'm just going to make this a child of that curve, and then they should move together so the camera is kind of rotating with it. Maybe move this slightly higher so it can kind of see that. And then in my camera properties, I'm going to play with this field of view to just make it look a little smaller. Okay. Some kind of interesting things happening there. I like this little eclipse that's happening whenever it's hitting a surface. So what I'm going to actually do here is I'm going to show you a kind of limitation to the path constraint right now. So if I can quickly add a material to this, and let's add a layer here, image map, load image, and I'm going to select that earth image that we were using in the texturing video. Now if this was the earth and it was traveling around the sun, it would be rotating as well, right? So the earth would be rotating, and if we were trying to do that, we wouldn't be able to, because if we go to our rotate tool, it's gonna not let us do it because it's locked off. And if we go to that path constraint, because we have the axis that it's traveling along, attempting to do this roll is not going to help us, even if we kind of play around with the up vector and trying to change which direction we want to roll in. Say like 1, 0. That's just going to kind of rotate it from its beginning and limit what we can do here. So what we can kind of do is rebuild that constraint a little bit differently. Right now I'm just going to look at that constraint to see what it's doing, and I'm going to throw in a locator object. So I'm going to click this down arrow, throw in a locator, and this is just going to be what is, it's going to be a point in space that's going to be attached to that curve. What I can actually do is just move this path constraint from, actually it might not let me do that, no. So I wanted to just move this into that locator instead, but since it won't let me, I'm going to rebuild it. I'm going to select that and then the curve and create a path constraint, and I'm going to basically do the same animation here. Let's see if it'll let me copy that. So right click, copy, let's go to this guy, right click, paste, and yep, so that full animation is there. And now we're going to delete this constraint from the sphere, and we're going to create a position key constraint between this and the locator. So position, and so now the camera, or sorry, the sphere is going to be looking like it's doing the same thing, but it's actually just got a position constraint to that point, the locator, and the locator is actually going around that curve. But what we can do now is we can actually rotate this because it's just the child, essentially, the position child of the locator. So if we were to go in here and say these numbers wouldn't work out because I don't have enough frames. But if we were to, in one rotation in 120 frames, we would want to spin this 360 degrees, 364 or 365 times, which won't really show in 120 frames. So we're going to change that a little bit, and we're just going to animate this rotation. So let's key the rotation there, and then we'll say at frame 120, we've rotated in Y 360 times 6 times. So now that planet is kind of spinning, right, as well as rotating. Let's take like a closer look at that. So what we can do here is look through the camera. So yeah, the Earth is kind of spinning as it spins around the sun. Of course, in that example, the sun wouldn't be moving up and down like that with this ring, but it is kind of an interesting way to get around the restrictions of the path constraint or kind of build it from scratch. You can use a locator a lot of times to kind of just be an in-between whenever certain larger or pre-built constraints aren't getting the job done for you. Okay, let's stop there, and then we will start looking at how to fine-tune our animations and change or animate different values on things outside of just your geometry.